Today we're going to talk about empiricism. It's a philosophical view that goes all the way back to Aristotle in Western philosophy and through many of the great empiricists of the early modern period, especially John Locke, George Berkeley, David Hume. It also became very powerful in the 20th century with the movement of the logical empiricists, people like Moritz Schlick, Rudolf Carnap, in many ways, W.V. Quine. There are a variety of people who still are heavily influenced by that empiricist movement, either of the earlier, more psychological form or the later logical form. What is empiricism? Well, if we look at it carefully, there are two main theses. I'm going to refer to these as concept empiricism and judgment empiricism. What's the difference? A concept empiricist is somebody who says all of our concepts come from experience. We don't have any concepts that are innate, built in us, inborn. Instead, everything is derived from experience. Ultimately, the foundations are, as Locke put it, sensation and reflection. Sensation, information coming to us from the outside world, through the five senses. But what about reflection? Well, that refers to our internal awareness of our own states of consciousness. That's an aspect of experience too, one that the empiricists tend to think that rationalists neglect and treat as in some way a priori or innate. But the empiricist says, no, that's not true. Even Descartes' I think, I am, is something that we derive from experience. It's the experience of thinking that makes me think about thinking, that gives me the concept of thinking and the concept of myself. So, according to the empiricist, all of our concepts come from experience. Now, that's not to say that our minds don't have certain inborn abilities. We have the ability to abstract ideas from experience. We have the idea to form concepts on the basis of experience, to combine various ideas or concepts to form new ones. We have the ability to perform logical operations on concepts. We can conjoin them, disjoin them, this or that. We can put if-then statements and do a variety of other things logically to create more complex concepts. But all of those concepts, in the end, trace back to experience. I've put it in my video on rationalism that we can think of a concept as a kind of cognitive ability. And what the empiricist is talking about is not the utter absence when we're born of cognitive abilities. It's really not quite the blank sheet of paper that Locke talks about, or the tabula rasa in Leibniz's criticism of that. Instead, it's really something more like this. We've got a program that does have content in that there's information in the program, but there is no input into the program as yet. All of the input comes from experience. So we could say that all the first order cognitive abilities, all the cognitive abilities that have to do with the world itself, those are coming to us from experience. All the inputs into the system come from experience. However, the system itself does have a structure. Our minds are structured to have certain abilities to do things with concepts, to do things with the information that we receive from experience. So we've got programming in the brain, that part is inborn, but the actual inputs, the actual information being fed into the system, that comes entirely from experience. Both external experience through the senses and that internal experience of our own mental states. Judgment empiricism has to do with truths, with knowledge, and it claims that all of our knowledge comes from experience. So it's not just that the building blocks, the concepts come from experience, the ways in which we put them together also come from experience. To put it another way, there are no synthetic a priori truths. Maybe, according to some versions of empiricism, there are a priori truths, things that we derive independently of experience, but they are entirely logical. They're entirely verbal. They are the things we've described as analytic truths. They don't give us any actual information about the world. In Locke's language, they're trifling propositions. Things like a soul is a soul, or lead is a metal, or a variety of other things that he thinks of as true by definition. Something like bachelors are unmarried. But all other knowledge, all synthetic knowledge that's really about the world, comes from experience. Things like dogs bark, there are dogs, and so on. All of those things come from experience. We can't simply analyze the concept of dog to realize that dogs bark or that there are dogs. So those kinds of things, the things that give us real information about the world, those all come from experience. Now, some versions of empiricism, like Quine's or like earlier John Stuart Mill's, don't set aside a special class of logical or verbal truths, the analytic ones, and say, well, those can be a priori, but not everything else. Instead, John Stuart Mill and Willard Van Orman Quine hold that everything comes from experience. There is no sharp line dividing the analytic from the synthetic, or the a priori from the a posteriori for that matter. There is no way to say that anything is absolutely independent of experience. Everything is part of the web of concepts and the web of beliefs that we have, that we create in order to make sense of the world. So it's all a response to experience. There is no special category that we can separate off. Now, what about something like bachelors or unmarried? It seems like that is something that's purely a verbal truth. It's not really about the world. But both Quine and earlier Mill would say all of those things are really, in some sense, part of that fabric of experience, part of the fabric that is woven with some facets of meaning, with some facets of experience, and they're woven in such complex ways we can't really say that everything is independent of experience. We have experience of marriage, of people being single or people being married, of male and female. We put together various concepts as part of the way that we react to experience. And all of those concepts are somewhat open-ended and the kinds of things that are shaped by the sorts of experiences that we have. So, according to them, there is no way to divide out the clearly logical from the clearly empirical or synthetic. Now, certainly some things seem closer to truths by virtue of meaning. Other things seem closer to pure truths that come from our knowledge of the world. But according to those philosophers, there's no way to make a sharp divide. It's a matter of degree, and nothing gets to extreme points in the scale where meaning is irrelevant or the world is irrelevant. To sum up then, empiricism consists of two theses. Concept empiricism, that says there are no concepts except those we derive from experience. All concepts come from experience. And judgment empiricism, the view that all of our knowledge comes from experience. According to Locke, the concept view really implies the judgment view. Why? Well, if you don't have any innate building blocks, how could you have any innate knowledge? Basically, you form propositions and know things by virtue of putting concepts together. Things like bachelors or unmarried or dogs bark. Well, there's no way to do that if you don't have the concepts already, so innately we couldn't have either one. Now, I think we have to be careful here, because it might be that we have certain innate structures in the mind that are not mobilized yet because we don't have the relevant concepts. But the moment we have the concepts, they fit together in a certain way and the mind puts them together in some ways. So I'm not sure that Locke is right about that. It's very tempting to say you can't have a building without the building blocks. That's his argument, basically. But we could say, well, you could have the structure ready and waiting to put them together. So there is a kind of, admittedly, not quite the innate knowledge because you don't have the required concepts. Nevertheless, you have the innate structures that, given the concepts, automatically put them together to give you knowledge. And sometimes I think that's really Leibniz's view when he talks about things being innate, even though it takes some experience to trigger them, to activate them. So we should be careful about those issues. It's complicated. In contemporary linguistics, psychology, cognitive science, the divide between the rationalists and the empiricists persists. It is by no means resolved as yet, but it does seem to me that further scientific developments, a better knowledge of psychology, of neurophysiology, of cognitive science, may give us deep insights into the nature of the mind, and in particular, what kinds of concepts and what kinds of structures that would at least produce knowledge when activated might be innate in us.